Hi everyone, today I'm going to tell you about the land snails of Batu caves. First of all, we're going to look into what land snails are and their relationship with the limestone hills. And then next, we're going to look into what kind of land snails we found in Batu caves. And finally, we're going to propose a couple of new studies in the future. So what are land snails? Well, land snails belong to a group of animals called mollusks, which includes clams, squids, cuttlefishes, and others. A snail generally has a shell, and those without a shell are called slugs. Both snails and slugs belong to the same group called the gastropods. A section of the snail that's very obvious to us is, of course, the shell, and the animal that comes out of the shell and crawls about, that particular section of that animal is called a foot. This foot is very muscular and it helps with the snail's locomotion. And at the front end of this foot is where the head is located, and the head has tentacles. Those tentacles are the sensory organs of the snail. And underneath those, there's also the mouth part of the snail with rows of teeth called radula that helps with the snail's feeding. So when you remove a shell from the snail, you see that underneath that shell is a bunch of internal organs. These internal organs are wrapped up in a tissue called the mantle. The mantle also helps with the respiration of the snail by having lungs and gills at that particular section. So what's the relationship between land snails and limestone hills? Well, a lot of land snails in Malaysia are found across all kinds of habitats, from mangroves all the way to the top of the mountains. But limestone hills stand out as a critical habitat for land snails. First of all, because limestone hills is a rich source of calcium carbonate from limestone itself. Calcium carbonate is important for the development of shells of the snail. So that's why you see more snails on limestone hills than elsewhere. But limestone hills also provide lots of great habitat because over millions of years, limestone hills have eroded to form deep valleys and crevices and caves and so on. And those are perfect habitats to maintain moisture the snail needs. And that's why you see limestone hills have among the highest endemism and abundance of land snails in Malaysia. Now, endemism here just means that species are found on one or a few hills and nowhere else in the world. Now, to give you an example of this, here's a full range of species from Perak's limestone hill that we found in 2016. There are 122 species around the limestone hills of Ipoh. And of all these, 34 of these snails are found only on one out of the 12 hills that we have surveyed around Ipoh. So that's why there are lots of endemic species on limestone hills. But what's the reason behind that? To understand this, we need to look at the distribution of limestone hills in Peninsular Malaysia. And if you zoom in and fly around this region, you see that the limestone hills exist as islands in the landscape, separated from each other by acidic soils, rivers, seas, and flatlands. And each of these snail species living on these separated islands of hills become isolated, and over millions of years they have evolved into different species. Hence, you see high land snail endemism and diversity on Malaysian limestone hills. So, what's the role of land snails and the limestone ecosystem in the limestone ecosystem? Well, one of the main important points of a land snail is that they perform the recycling of nutrients in soils as the role of a decomposer of dead plants, fungi, and animal materials, as well as a predator for small invertebrates like snails and worms themselves. So how do snails undertake such activities? In other words, how do they eat? Well, snails have hundreds of teeth and are called the radula that's used to scrape food like algae, wood, and meat and break them down into smaller pieces to eat. If you have a snail, you stick it up on a transparent piece of plastic or glass underneath, and you tend to see them having this rasping motion on your mouth parts. That those rasping parts are the radula. If you're walking by on along a garden, and you look at these algae covered walls. Sometimes you see these trails left by the snails after they feed on the algae on the surface of these uh, walls. Now, snails are also eaten by a lot of creatures. Sometimes when you're walking on the limestone hill forest path, sometimes you come across piles of broken snail shells like these. If you are patient enough, you sit at a corner with your camouflage gear and maybe your camera, you will eventually come across the predator of this snail. One of those most obvious ones are the whistling thrush, a kind of bird that specializes in eating snails and invertebrates by smashing the snail shells onto the rocks until the shell breaks apart so that the birds can extract the soft parts out. Similarly, snails are also eaten by rodents, by porcupines, and many other creatures. So some of the studies have shown that birds that hang out around areas with lots of snails and that predates on snails tend to produce stronger and thicker shelled eggs, increasing the survival of their young. So snails play some roles in the ecosystem of limestone hills. So what sort of land snails have been found in Batu Cave so far? Well, lots of scientists have been wondering about this, and they have visited and collected snails on Batu caves over the last centuries on multiple occasions. Scientific explorations of Batu cave snails began in 1907, but most of the studies are done in the 20s, 1920s, 1930s, 50s, 60s, and 90s. A total of 26 studies have been conducted there. These studies range from descriptions of new species on species checklist as well as studying the ecology of snails. Now, most of these studies collected specimens that are deposited in the museums of Singapore, the UK, and the Netherlands, reflecting the researchers' home institutions. Now, in the past 15 years, we have local researchers, my colleagues Ruben Clemens, Lifthor Singh, Muhammad Effendi Mazuki, or Fendi, and me, which all of us have began in-depth research on Peninsular Malaysian limestone hill snails, including Batu caves. So particularly for Batu caves, my colleague Fendi has been sampling land snails in 3 locations on the southwest part of Batu caves. So what Fendi did was to look for snails on each of these sites by looking on the trees and shrubs because some snails live on plants. And Fendi also looked for snails on the rocks because some snails are specialized on living on the rocks and feeding on the mosses on the rocks. And finally, Fendi also searched for snails on the forest floor among leaf litter and collected around a few liters of leaf litter at each of these plots. Why do we collect leaf litter? Well, this is because land snail shells tend to accumulate on the forest floor after dropping from trees, rock walls, as well as all those living within the leaf litter itself. Now, once we are back in the lab, we sorted out the snails and the micro snails, those that are less than 5 mm from the leaf litter, and this is how we discover most of the snails. And finally, I visited the dark cave in 2018 and made some observations there. I have to thank my friend Juliana Nordin, who worked in the CMG cave management group back in 2018, who showed me and pointed out the snails in the cave. They are living in the cave. And so once we sorted out those snails, we examined them with the microscope and magnifying lens, and we compared them with the hundreds and thousands of the specimens that were collected by previous scientists and those publications they have made over that period, to verify and confirm the species of each of these shells found. And all these specimens are then properly catalogued, curated, and stored in storage vials and containers. And finally, they will be deposited in the Bodensis collection of the Institute of Tropical Biology and Conservation, University of Malaysia Sabah, so that future researchers can revisit those specimens down the road. So overall, we found 51 species of land snails and freshwater cave snail in Batu Caves. And more details can be found in the poster, but let's break down the findings here. So for species that are not native and originate from all over the world, we found 8 species. These are the species that are most common in human inhabited areas. You will often find these in your garden, vegetable plots, fruit gardens, and so on. And then there are non-native species. There are native species that are widely distributed within Peninsular Malaysia and Southeast Asia. Those we found 30 species. And then there are 2 species that are only known from the limestone hills of Selangor. And finally, for Batu caves, we found 12 species that are known only from Batu caves so far. Now, it's tempting for us to say that these 12 species are endemic to Batu caves, but we strongly advise against doing so until more rigorous studies is done. So what do we mean by this? Well, we proposed two particular studies to address this question of endemism. First of all, to find out if land snail species are indeed endemic to Batu caves, we recommend a systematic study of all other limestone and non-limestone hills nearby to verify the distribution of these species. This will involve a comprehensive biodiversity inventory of each hill using a sampling regime of 4 to 5 plots per hill, similar to the Perak study that we did in 2016. Second, we also recommend studying the endemism of cave snails, especially this freshwater snail called Gabia minuta, which so far is known only from Dark Cave. Specifically, we recommend a thorough survey of the freshwater and terrestrial snail species within the caves to find out if they are endemic to just one cave or found throughout the many caves of Batu Cave Hill, or are the hills nearby, or are they actually found also outside of the caves in open daylight. And that's it. Thank you to Ruben Clemens, Lee Singh, and Ruth Q for the advice over the initial stages of making this checklist. And thanks to Juliana Nordin for pointing out the snails in Dark Cave back in 2018. And thanks to Atika and the team for facilitating this symposium. If you're interested in what we have been researching on snails and limestone, please follow us on our social media pages. And I look forward to have you again in the future. Thank you.